All right, how's it going, guys? Welcome to another video by the Debate Highline. I'm Flynn Williams, and today we're just going to be going over an topic, a lecture or analysis for the Lincoln Douglas January-February topic. So the topic is Resolve the Possession of Nuclear Weapons is Immoral. A quick breakdown of what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be going over definitions of the words in the topic, then we'll be going over affirmative ground, then negative ground. So the first definition that we need to cover here is possession, and the Oxford Languages says it's the state of having, owning, or controlling something. And that presumably means states who have nuclear weapons is kind of not the actor in this resolution, but the people who we are evaluating. So here in this map, we can see that the United States, the UK, France, Iran, Russia, North Korea, China, and many more countries have nuclear weapons. Next is a definition of nuclear weapons. So Oxford Languages again says it's a bomb or missile that uses nuclear energy to cause an explosion, either through kind of fission or fusion chain reactions. And varying definitions of what nuclear weapons mean, i.e. getting into the nitty-gritty of the science of it all, may be important when assessing the validity of certain picks, counterplans, disads, etc. So we'll get into some of that when we talk about negative ground. Now, also, we have the definition of is, which is a present tense linking verb, which links the noun nuclear weapons to the verb immoral. So that would insinuate it assesses a state of being. So, for example, she is like moral, or she is happy, etc. So here we have an example of like life is good with that GIF over there. And then it's also present tense. So that may also be important when certain counterplans or picks say that nuke's possession could be moral in the future. You could argue that we only have to defend, or the affirmative only has to defend the possession of nuclear weapons as they exist right now. Another thing to note about the wording of this resolution is that it's not the usual ought and there's no actor. So it's going to be a question of debates whether the AF should have to defend a policy action like nuclear disarmament. Then finally, we have a definition of moral, which kind of insinuates that this topic tests the truth, is a truth testing topic, in that we have to kind of have a moral philosophy to evaluate the possession of nukes. So we can get into some specific philosophical positions as it relates to the topic, but also others that aren't so heavily philosophical, but rather your regular, structural violence, utilitarianism, etc. So let's go into kind of the affirmative topic analysis or side of this debate. So first we have colonialism. This one is one that you will see a lot, and it's because that nuke testing, use, and storage have a strong historical link to forms of colonialism and coercion. So, for example, uranium mining that goes into the creation of nuclear weapons comes mostly from coerced labor in the Congo or other African states. The United States has historically tested on Shoshone and Navajo territory, as well as a litany of other examples, like France testing on Algerian land, its former colony, and China using Tibetan land as well. Next, we have inevitability. So this is one of the main policy kind of advantages on this topic, which is saying that nuclear war is inevitable, and kind of the only way to stop it is by getting rid of nuclear weapons. This one is kind of more material in defending disarmament of nuclear weapons, and there are many different reasons or warrants as to why nuclear war can be inevitable, which you can take in any direction you want. So, for example, you can have specific scenarios that make nuclear war inevitable, such as the Indian-Pakistan conflict, Taiwan conflict, South China Sea as a whole, Arctic, etc. And so that all kind of plays into the inevitability of nuclear war. Additionally, there's some mathematicians or scientists who have also studied the inevitability of nuclear war and saying, kind of making a logical argument that the probability is never zero if we possess nuclear weapons. So in order to get rid of the risk of nuclear war, which causes extinction, we need to be able to get rid of them. And then there's also kind of new developments such as cyber warfare, where people can hack into and control nukes. So specifically, rogue actors may be able to cause nuclear war by hacking into them. And that could also lead to things like miscalculation and the idea that we've been lucky, we haven't been kind of smart about our possession of nuclear weapons. Then is also kind of a more critical position in feminism. So Nukes are, again, like linked to structures of patriarchy and toxic masculinity. There's lots of literature on this, and kind of giving them up is seen as weakness or manliness, right? So the use of nukes is justified, or or possession of nukes is justified through kind of being manly and being a nation that is capable of defending itself, which has strong ties to masculinity, patriarchy, etc. Then we have spec AFs that we'll see on this topic. So you could choose to specify a specific country or nuclear weapons. So for example, there's AFs that specify Israel, Russia, dual-use bombers, and if you want to defend a spec AF, you should be prepared to answer tier theory arguments that tell you you have to defend all possession of nuclear weapons. And then we have Kant. So Kant is the more philosophy-based position on this topic. It says possession of nukes is intrinsically immoral under things like the categorical imperative because it coerces other people and takes them hostage. So like mutually assured destruction and deterrence, which we'll talk about later, require a credible threat of use, which kind of uses violence towards others, or the potential for violence towards others, as a means to an end, or a form of threatening others, which is bad under Kant. So now we're going to go to the negative side of this resolution to look at potential ways to interact with the affirmative layers that we just talked about. So the first disad that is probably the most stock issue on this topic is deterrence. So it could be argued that nukes deter war because of things like mutually assured destruction. And what that kind of means is if one country nukes another country with nukes, that country will just kind of nuke that country back, and it'll just create massive destruction, which kind of deters major countries that have nukes from going to war with each other. And so a couple of warrants are that there has like no major war between two great powers has happened since the creation of nuclear weapons. Obviously, there's been proxy wars during the Cold War, but no direct confrontation between two major powers. And of course, when there is a confrontation between those powers, such as India and Pakistan, the deaths in that conflict have decreased. So the deaths decreased by 90% compared to the conflict before they got nuclear weapons, which may prove that the possession of nuclear weapons is able to deter people from going too hard or creating too much damage. So basically the thesis of deterrence is that without nukes, we're more likely to go to war, which leads to extinction. There's also another common disad, which is assurances, and it basically is based on the theory of the nuclear umbrella, and nukes possessors makes their allies feel safe, and without them they are more likely to proliferate to feel more secure. So for example, the Japan or South Korea are reliant on the United States as a form of umbrella for its security. So if someone attacks Japan, they are kind of know that the United States will back them up with their nuclear weapons, and that if the United States got rid of their nuclear weapons, Japan would feel less secure, and it would lead to bad things like proliferation, arms races, etc., which you could say increase the risk of conflict, war, extinction, etc. Then another disad is shift. So this could happen in many different ways, but the thesis of shift is that states getting rid of nukes will make them feel less secure, so much like the allies and the assurances disad. So they'll try to do things to fulfill that gap in security. So they'll increase conventional forces, they'll develop more hypersonic missiles, they'll use bio and chemical weapons, etc. And this argument is reliant on winning that affirmative disarms nuclear weapons. Now, a counterplan that is also common on this topic is NFU, or no first use, and it basically says that possessors should be able to possess nuclear weapons to deter acts of aggression, but shouldn't use them unless they are physically threatened, so they shouldn't use them first, right? So that solves kind of the inevitability advantages, because nuclear war is not inevitable if you can only use them in certain instances, or if you're kind of using them only if others use it first. So it kind of has a net benefit of deterrence because you're still able to keep nuclear weapons, but you're not going to use them. Then there's a kind of pick of asteroids. So this one just says that possession of nuclear weapons is moral if we use it to deflect asteroids. There's a couple of scientific studies that nukes are good at deflecting asteroids, and we need them to be able to deflect them because otherwise nukes hitting Earth causes extinction, which is bad. And then we have kind of Hobbes and property rights that says the possession of something cannot be immoral and people have a right to possess things. So this also kind of goes hand in hand with a burdens argument that says the affirmative has to defend strictly the possession of nuclear weapons being immoral and not kind of the potential use of nuclear weapons or the testing of nuclear weapons, etc. And so this argument tries to say that the possession of something cannot intrinsically be immoral. So, like, for example, I could possess a kitchen knife and I could use it to cut apples or stab someone, right? But the potential for me to stab someone with a kitchen knife does not automatically make my possession of that knife immoral. Also, more Hobbes specific is kind of that the sovereign or sovereign nation should be able to seek power like nukes to defend its citizens as a part of the social contract. And coercion by using or possessing nukes is then justified because you are doing it as a part of that social contract. Now, kind of critique that you could read on this topic is International Relations Critique, or IR Critique, and it says that kind of non-proliferation or moral crusading of nuclear weapons within current IR reproduces racism and colonialism. So it causes like the policing of smaller states, it causes hypocrisy, etc. So a good example of this is kind of the NPT, or the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And what happened during this was states like the United States and other European nations, etc., were all able to kind of police or coerce other nations like Iran, who hadn't had nuclear weapons, to tell them that they couldn't have it, but they kept their nuclear weapons. So it's just a critique of the ways that global power structures work and how the result of the plan will lead to even more colonialism or kind of controlling of smaller states. And then another critique is just the securitization critique, which I think will be very prevalent on this topic because there are many policy style affirmatives that use existential rhetoric. And the crux of securitization says that the use of existential rhetoric to justify moralism or to say that things are immoral is bad, and it creates a justification for more violence and oppression. So there's many examples, like the United States flooding indigenous homeland. I believe it was like the Seneca, and they flooded the homes of those indigenous peoples to make way for hydroelectric dams that would supposedly help fight back against the quote-unquote existential risk of the US. And that is kind of an example of securitization logic being used to justify colonialism, oppression, violence, etc. There's other examples such as kind of anti-Muslim sentiment after 9/11 because they were supposedly existential threats to the security of the United States, etc. Also, like the United States calling China authoritarian and oppressive to justify the United States' control over territories in the SCS kind of allows them to expand colonialism under the guise of fighting back against authoritarianism. So in all, that is kind of all of our negative prep. There's obviously probably more positions that we could read, but I hope that this gave you guys a good understanding of the topic, gave you some kind of groundwork to be able to start creating your own prep. And please reach out to me if you need any articles. I know lots of articles for lots of these positions, so if you're interested in running any of these positions, please reach out to me. And yeah, thanks for watching.